Welcome in. We are talking about profit levers for your practice, distinct things that you can dive into to significantly increase the performance and therefore the profit of your business. And today is talking about your clinical intake close rate, how many leads you get, how many of those leads turn into paying clients. Attilio, maybe tee us up. Why is this a profit lever compared to something else? What is going on here that makes this a distinct thing that a practice owner should focus on that will unlock growth and profit in the practice?
Yeah, intake close rate is a multiplier for your practice, which means if you do a bad job, you're multiplying by zero. And if you multiply anything by zero, it zeroes out. So if you spend a lot of money on your marketing, or you just spent $10,000 refreshing your website, but you're dropping the ball here, this is where everything funnels down to, and it all comes down to this. And so if you don't work on this, and there isn't a consistent process for your intake, for your intakes and your intake closings, and you're not actually tracking how effective, it all stops here, which is never good. And I would say that intake success, just increasing by a few percentages here and there, actually multiplies your outputs. So changing from a 10% intake close rate in a cash practice to a 15% close rate, that's 50% increase on what you're able to get from
Right.
from that lead bucket there. So it's a multiply. It's a multiply button, and if you multiply well, you get great returns. If you don't multiply well, you zero everything out.
Yeah, we're going to go through 4 distinct recommendations on how to improve your intake close ratio and just focus on this as a lever. Before we get there, when I was a sales rep for the Chicago Tribune, I was doing a mix of like recruitment consulting and sales work. My business unit, me personally, that I was responsible for was geared to generate more than $800,000 in annual revenue for the Tribune. And that was my goal that I was responsible for, drive that cash essentially. And I knew essentially, as I boiled it down, exactly how many phone calls I needed to make to outbound leads, to make the new connections I needed to make, to get the amount of presentations that I needed to make, to know the amount of follow-ups I needed to make, to know how many deals we're going to close that day, week, month, and year. And it truly was a numbers game first and foremost, that was then backed up by content, saying the right thing, describing the right thing, selling the right thing. And the good news is therapists have no hindrance of great quality content behind them, meaning you have awesome clinicians probably, you have awesome service sets, you have clinical outcomes that clients potentially want. And so although we can focus on drawing out great content to have in your intake process and have in your marketing process, most practices underwhelmingly do not have enough actions, rhythms, or emphasis on just the process needed to build a successful intake process. You massively underestimate in today's market compared to 3, 5, or 10 years ago, if you've been running your practice for a while, how much work is needed to create the connective tissue around a sales process that will convert clients. And I've experienced this in other industries where it feels extreme and it feels massive. And unfortunately, the industry in the mental health space is looking closer to that now than ever before. But if you're armed with this knowledge and some of the recommendations we're about to give, you can build a process that will afford you the growth and the lever of profit you want in your practice.
I'll maybe add too, just on the backside of that, is that your intake process is a service to your clients. Like, we talk about numbers game because numbers exist in business, guys. Like, we need to speak to a quotient of people in order to derive some clients from that bucket. And it's even more important if you niche down, or you have a really specific need bracket that you work with, or a very specific acuity of symptoms, or whatever else that you're maybe really trying to target. And so having a higher volume of people that you talk to, that you're serving in this intake capacity, that's what's going to create a good reputation. That's what's going to create a productive environment for your practice.
100%. Let's get into tip number one. It's get in contact with all of your leads within the first 5 minutes. And if you can, organize your practice to do live answering for as much of the week and as much of the day space as possible. Contact your leads within 5 minutes, and if you can, do live answering. And I want to rebuff one big objection we hear all the time with our therapists, and that is, oh, we always see that the best leads, the best people looking for therapy, they don't need to be contacted within 5 minutes, or they don't need a live phone call. They'll follow back up with us through the email or go through the effort. I do believe that's true. So that's number one, is I do mostly believe that's true, is the warmest people, the hottest people, the people willing to buy you, it's a little bit more transactional. There's a massive bucket of people now that are not there yet. And we know they're not there yet. And if we ignore the other probably 60 to upwards of 90% of people that isn't that lead type, that's just willing to be patient and take the initiative to get on your calendar and reply to emails and go through a 3, 5, 7 day process to get on the calendar, then we are losing the extra 5 to 10 to maybe 15% close ratio that will actually make your practice profitable in your intake work the way that it's supposed to. And 5 to 10% doesn't sound like a lot, but as Attilio said earlier, if you move it from 10% to 20%, well, you're actually doubling your lead close volume coming in from those numbers. So just know that that might be true for some of your leads, but also we have to look where the optimization can happen.
I want to double down on that because it's so incredibly important. Just because someone fills out a form and says that they're really interested in working with you, and then they stop messaging you back after you try calling them right away, doesn't mean that they weren't ready for therapy. It doesn't mean that they weren't ready to work with you. It doesn't mean that they weren't committed to the process. It just means that they're a normal, regular person in today's world.
Yeah.
Like a normal person fills out information, expects to get followed up with, and then they get followed up with on some capacity because it happens so frequently. Like that is the process. That's what people expect. And I think it's maybe closer to 90%, Josh. It might be maybe 95% actually. So like, yeah, we know practices, it's indisputable at this point. The practices that optimize to live answer phone calls and get back with clients in like sub 10, sub 5 minutes, when they send a form or send a phone call, their close rates are 20 to 40% better than the counterparts that don't do this thing. And now I hear you, it's difficult to maybe have live answers if you're a smaller practice, but this also means that maybe you're only running ads during those time windows. Maybe this also means that you just try your best. And prioritize getting someone to help you with intake, because it's a very low cost position. Anyone who's making more than $40,000 a year can afford a international full-time virtual assistant that can help you answer phone calls, and at the very least just answer the phone call and then have them book a call for you to connect a little bit later. So
yeah, totally appropriate for someone that doesn't have all the knowledge and skills for the full intake conversation, to just act as the buffer, have a quick qualifying conversation, have a quick warm connection, say, hey, my goal is just to know which person to connect you with, aka the practice owner or the main admin that isn't in office that day or whatever. Get it on the calendar, and that person will probably show up for it if that's the type of rhythm that you're taking. When I was in high school, one of my older sisters started to work at Olive Garden, and she came back that first week that she got that job, and she was describing to me the menu of things that they had to literally memorize the entire Olive Garden menu and then script their interactions as they introduce themselves to customers, take orders, and do all of this thing. And Olive Garden, massively successful franchise, especially in the cohort of that restaurant type, 2000s and 2010s, maybe a little less relevant today. Maybe some of you love it. I don't know. But it struck me in high school like, wow, That is an extreme amount of work that every single waitress, just to have a job at the end of the week, had to pass menu tests, fully memorized, pass scripting tests, fully memorized. The level of rigor was massive. And that brings us to tip number 2, which is you have to script everything from your text to your emails, and then especially the actual consult call. And you have to role play it. If your admin is underperforming, and often they are, it's often not because they don't want to perform or they don't have the skills. They just have not been given the environment to get the language and the reps in, which is the script and the role play outside of doing the live work. I rarely come across a practice that has poor performing intake, right? And they have any sort of administrative structure around role playing and scripting. I might have used a double negative there. But all to say is if you put this in place, it's one of the most surefire ways to make sure the phone skills, the energy, and the level of competence you want on the other end of that phone is in place. If you don't practice, it will come off as not practice and underperform.
Yeah. This is where maybe some science and I think understanding why you do the things you do gets to come out. This is maybe also where you also get to feel the competence when you actually have a script, you actually role play it, and you're talking to someone.
Yeah.
If you're on the line with someone who's like fumbling through what to say or who to match with, or it just it maybe just feels like they're not all the way there, the energy, something's off. It's a surefire way to put someone completely off of working with you. Like even if you had the perfect therapist on your team to fit their exact needs and you were going to do a great job with them, that first interaction is that important.
Yeah.
And I'll also say you have an unfair advantage when you script things. When you script things, it also means that you get to try something 10, 20 times and then say, you know what, I think I'm going to change it like this and see how that change affects my next 10 or 20 people that I talk to. And so when it's scripted, you understand and you have a deeper understanding really of how changes affect the process. It gives you a better understanding of what actually is the output of what's existing and how do my changes or my tweaks affect the output. So scripting is incredibly important, guys. Plus, like templating emails and stuff just removes so much emotional burden from your team that it speeds up their position. It doesn't feel like they have to type an email from scratch every single time. They just have to literally use a template, copy and paste some information. And I think while you're also role playing, it helps you find areas where your staff doesn't know why you do the things that you do. And every time you role play, it lets you deepen the understanding for that position so that when they do understand why you do the things that you do, they become a more dynamic team member on those calls. And so I don't know if you've ever been to I was at the vet today and someone was trying to get me to, they were trying to get me to, I went in because I wanted to get my dog's teeth cleaned. And I asked some questions about the stuff and the person had no idea how to answer it. And I was like, oh, well, maybe I don't need to do this. Like, I have no clue what's happening. Like, I didn't know. I'm not a vet. I'm not a, whatever. So I had to wait I was lucky that the vet was coming in next. And so I got to ask the vet. But that's how your team looks. It's like if they don't know the questions or they don't know the whys or they don't know the whatevers, and you're not going to hop on the call right after, all of a sudden you let a lot of stuff slip away from you and your team.
I say that it takes usually about 50 reps, 50 role plays of a standard script and its variations for someone to actually feel semi-comfortable, maybe be a 7.5, 8 out of 10 on it. And just ask yourself, do you want your admin to have those 50 reps with the next 50 calls that they do with a live client, or do you want them to have them in office with yourself? It's a clear answer. Get those reps in. Get that role play in, as crazy as it sounds. Within this, another really practical tip is to create time blocks on your admin's calendars. We get this all the time. We got it literally today, a practice owner being like, I don't know what my admin's doing. I don't know how much work they're getting done. I don't know how to increase their performance on our team. Creating time blocks for them suggesting, requiring them to do is really important. My first type of time block I really like to implement is an outbound follow-up time block. You probably have a bunch of leads that you have followed up with 1, 2, 3 times, maybe after you got the initial form fill or the initial call. But there's probably a giant list of people that need an extra touch, a second email, a second text, just to follow up with in general. If you have an admin in your office on a daily basis, they should have somewhere between a 30 and 90-minute time block on their calendar where their entire job during that 30-minute period is sit down and get as many emails or as many phone calls doing outbound actions as possible. Not look up billing stuff, not track numbers, not literally do anything else. Just sit down and do the work. And I learned this in other sales organizations that I worked out. And this is when most of the work happened. The 2 hours a day, the morning that I did an hour call block, and the afternoon that I did an hour call block. The rest of the time it's kind of whatever. So zero in, they'll perform better, they'll get more reps in, they'll follow up with more people. And that's a huge, huge advantage because you know that when they show up, they're just going to get it done. And you can track it. How many calls, how many emails, how many text messages did you do in this block? Let's get a standard number. And that's what we're holding ourselves accountable to every time we do an outbound block. It's so transformative to an intake team when you implement this type of structure.
Yeah, I'll leave a note for you guys too on these outbound blocks. You're going to find yourself looking at specific segments frequently. You're going to say, "Hey, why, we've got 60 minutes on the calendar and we went through all of the people that we think we should go through. And now we have maybe like 30 extra minutes to not do anything else because maybe we figured out how to do some bulk outbound or maybe we figured out how to call really quick." So I think you're going to end up finding extra segments that you'll be able to follow up with here. And I think some of the extra segments are going to be like reactivating clients that haven't rebooked in a few months, or getting creative just with who or how your practice interacts with the individuals in your environment or not yet in your environment.
Yeah.
And I think that's where maybe some of this magic happens is you need to start setting a time where you're pressure cooking activities, and then when you produce in that bucket, you're going to say, great, we're producing faster and better, and however we're producing now. And since it's revenue generating, you're going to be hungry to find new ways to add extra items into that pressure cooker. And so
Certainly.
get creative, right?
Yeah.
Get creative. Just because you hit your numbers once doesn't mean that you can't keep bumping up or getting creative on how else to approach the situation. So create those time blocks and stay consistent.
Yeah. What doesn't happen naturally must be created manually. That's true for time blocks. That's true for role playing. What doesn't happen naturally must happen manually. If your admin isn't naturally great on the phone, it doesn't mean that you can't manually train that into them. Fun fact, most people actually aren't great on the phone. Most people don't want to pick up the phone and make 15 phone calls in a row. Like there might be some habits here that there's some resistance to in your intake team that you just need to train into them in a really healthy way. And that brings us to our last major tip. Fire underperformers, but train for high performance. Fire underperformers, but train for high performance. What does that mean, Attilio?
So I think what this looks like really is hire slow, fire fast is maybe another way to kind of look at this. So like, if your team members are not meeting expectations that you're setting or cannot put you in a position to succeed based on the numbers that you've set out from maybe your business plan or maybe some advisors or otherwise, you need to move quickly to remove them from the practice. And what's really nice about training and working with administrative team members too is that there are some real solid rock stars out there. And if you do a great job with your infrastructure on how you're training, on the expectations that you're setting, on providing them with everything that they need to be successful, then you have laid all the foundation to fire them quickly as well.
Yeah.
So I think like, yes, take it on yourself as a leader to lead and manage effectively. But just like there's some great people out there, there's also some bad people out there. And like we said at the beginning here, intake is a multiplier, but there is a chance that you multiply by 0 here. And there is a chance that you multiply by 1 here. And that's not very useful in a business context. And so if you find yourself multiplying by 0 or multiplying by 1, you may need to find a way to drastically make a change and come up with an employee performance plan, or fire the person.
Yeah.
And hurry up.
A really good indication is if you have a great process and you've taken the time to build a great detailed oriented process and an employee can't or won't follow it, they don't deserve to be there. If you have not built a great and detailed oriented process and an employee is struggling, you might not have all the information you need yet to know if they're actually the correct person or not. That's not always the case. Sometimes you just get into it and we know people, they've stolen, they've lied, they've just done really obvious things, even in like the early on of being enrolled. Like, cool, it doesn't matter, right, how well you are at this other thing, you just got to go. And unfortunately in the intake department, it happens often where the variance of people who graduate out of the role because they move on to something else, or they move into being a clinician, or they move into another organization, or whatever it is, it happens a lot. So the other caveat all of this is the better you build the process independent of the person, the more your practice is equipped to thrive and survive, regardless of who is that in that intake role. I think a lot of therapists will hold on to an admin longer than they should because they don't want to go through the pain and effort of getting a new person, training them, and trying to get it all up to speed. And that's kind of like some of the cost of this, but it's a lot more painful if you don't have anything documented, if you don't have rhythms, if you don't have KPIs. And we have to turn this all from good to great, because great practices that accomplish the goals that you probably want to accomplish have a great intake department.
Best of
We'll
luck,
catch you guys
guys.
next time.
We'll see.
Cheers.